So good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here a few days in Finland. Obviously, you're aware of just how much Finland is in the world spotlight at the moment with the EU presidency. It's kind of been in the spotlight of folk like myself for a longer time than that. Businessmen who notice how Finland consistently comes towards the top or at the top of international tables of economic competitiveness over recent years. And for somebody of the vintage of myself, there are legendary Finns such as Lassi Viren who are burned into our kind of collective psyche there. And one of my own countrymen, some years ago, Winston Churchill, said of Finland, Finland alone shows what free men can do. And I think that's reason enough for being here. So thank you. I hope you will show me as a free man what I can be doing. But my real agenda here is to share with you some of our experience as a large, pragmatic, practical company in using scenarios to think about the future and take decisions about the future that will help shape our future. So this isn't just about the storylines I'll be talking you through as an illustration, but it is also about the way that becomes integrated in the way that we do things. So the overall agenda that I'll run through will look something like this. A bit about scenarios, about the background, what they are, what they aren't. Some of the features of a well-grounded scenario, looking at the predetermined trends and the critical uncertainties that branch into different directions. And then using scenarios, a little bit of just personal experience about how those feature as part of the organizational DNA, as I've called it here. I'll be giving you a snapshot, and a snapshot in two ways. One, because in a short presentation I can only highlight certain features, but secondly, because while I'll talk through as an illustration our global scenarios that we published last year, these are really about the forces underlying them, and they can be applied with a specific focus. So my snapshot will be large at the global level, but I hope you will take the forces and the pressures that are illustrated and think about them in the context for yourselves, either in Finland or in your particular branch of business or government or whatever. So I'm from an energy company, and like many of you, I have to think across many different timelines. I myself personally have been involved in the energy industry for, it is 25 years, actually it's getting on for 26. And in fact, my hair is getting grayer and grayer, and my beard is completely grey. That's not only because of the challenges of the energy industry over the last 25 years, but it's also because of the pressures of managing different timescales from almost moments, certainly hours, in a trading or operational environment that I've worked in, through to thinking through significant investments. I'll highlight one particular investment at the moment. It's been in the news, our large investment in Russia, in Sakhalin, $20 billion of capital going into a politically challenging area, particularly politically challenging arena, but also an arena in which has pioneering elements in terms of the way that the project needs to be managed, the conditions in Sakhalin, and also the technology being applied. So very different timescales that you're thinking about, and we have to manage all those into particular actions today that we take, and how we prepare ourselves for the changes into tomorrow. So from moments all the way through to 50 years or more. And in fact, whilst I'll describe something around our current global geopolitical scenarios, which look out to 2025, we published in 2001 our long-term energy scenarios to 2050. And I'm currently working through our thinking, updating our understanding in the long-term energy arena out into the 2050-2060 period and beyond. Might even mention that a little bit as we go along. So, as practical people, what do we start with? We start with choices. We start with the decisions that are being made today. And we're practical folk, and one of the things that we need to recognize is the connection between our decisions today and the assumptions we're making. And it's very easy to make assumptions jumping to conclusions. And it's very easy for folk to assume that others see the world the same way that we see the world. And one of the great lessons is the value of making your assumptions about the future explicit. Just make them explicit. They're then open for challenge and consideration and development and improvement. And that's one of the first steps in thinking structurally and systematically about the future, making the assumptions explicit. And when you find you make them explicit, you find that there's kind of a hierarchy. There's large level assumptions which build on lower level assumptions. And as practical people, we can still see the connection between the decision or the choice and those assumptions. And then as you think deeper, when you think more deeply, you see that a number of these assumptions are actually connected, that political changes or political developments move a number of them all together, or macroeconomic developments, or societal developments. And hence you see how these things become correlated and need to be thought through together. And in fact, that is the connection between hard choices and decisions today and thinking about the storylines, the outlooks, the future, the scenarios, and those storylines that reflect the different ways of thinking about the scenarios. So if we look at scenarios versus a forecast, there is quite a difference. A forecast is something that narrows thinking down. You're saying there's something that you're predicting, and then you're going to optimize a path towards that. So scenarios are different to that. They help you think more broadly about the future. They're a vehicle, they're a tool for doing that. They recognize that within the current reality, there are different models of the world. There are different ways that people perceive the world and act on the world. And those choices today can emerge in different ways and different pathways over time and give you alternative images of the future. And so, again, the mental maps reflect something that was highlighted in the previous keynote from Andrew, that people are relational, that they're social, they influence each other, they're interdependent, they're comparative, and in all that process, different mental models are being enriched and applied and shape the future in different and unpredictable ways, but with ways that you can think about in a rational and systematic approach, and in ways which carry elements of predictability within their inherent uncertainty. So, let me focus now a little bit on these alternative storylines. Let me just remind you of the power of storylines. We actually respond to storytelling. We actually, in our hearts, recognize something authentic at some deep level around storytelling. I've illustrated here a young boy sitting on the knee of his grandparents and enjoying being told stories about the family. And just to let you in on the secret, that's my young son there, and my dad. And he's going to be thrilled when I tell him his photograph has been up and seen by such an eminent audience as yourselves in a country like Finland. So that's my little lad. And recently we were on vacation, and we actually had the ability to span 6 generations of stories going past through to our grandson. We actually also have not only a small son, but we have an older daughter who's got a son, our grandson, who's a little baby. And there were 6 generations represented there. So there's a great thread from the past through the present into the future. And the storylines somehow carry that. But at the same time, for the activities that we're involved in, the storylines need to have a certain structure and system to be useful. They have to have stories with a purpose. And that purpose really is to improve decisions today, to improve execution, because there's a certain amount of ability to share understanding and appreciate different stories and different storylines. And it's about preparing the leadership today for the challenges that they'll face as they emerge over the years ahead. And so these are stories with a purpose. And they have to be integrated into the way of doing things. And at the end of the presentation, I'll talk about that element. So what are the elements of a good scenario, a storyline with a purpose? Well, first is a recognition that there are predetermined trends. There is a link from the past into the present and into the future. There are things that we can say with a fair degree of certainty and that don't change much under alternative outlooks. If you are born today, individually there may be pressures upon you, but the likelihood is you will be here in 10 years' time. So demographics, for instance, has a certain element of predetermined trend in it. If you buy a Mercedes today, it is likely that it will be operating somewhere in the world in 20 years' time. Might not be still in your garage, but it'll be in somebody's garage somewhere. So there are predetermined trends. So I'll just highlight a couple of the predetermined trends that have helped shape these particular storylines that I'm going to use as an illustration. First of all, demographics, as I've already hinted. By 2050, something like 8 to 10, say 9 billion people on the planet by 2050. There will be social movement. Round about 2 million people per year immigrating from or into developed countries from undeveloped countries. But despite that immigration, given the overall demographic trends and the birth rates, still seeing a shift in the average, or in the world population, in the weight of the world population towards the developing countries. A large nation like China, which has got something like 1.3 billion people today, by 2050 will not have grown so significantly. Round about perhaps 1.4 billion people. The impact, of course, of the population steps that have been taken over recent years. India, another example, fewer people than China today, about 1 billion, but 1.5 billion, a bigger country in 2050. Impact on political balances, impact on economic influence. Those are question marks, but that demographic trend is fairly well set in place. Africa, 0.8 billion people today, 1.8 billion people 2050, despite the ravages of HIV and AIDS. Another important demographic trend, urbanization. In the developed world, we currently have about 75% of the population living in urban centers. By 2025, you're probably talking about a drift upwards to 80%. But in the undeveloped world, you're looking at a shift from just over 40% to just over 50% in that time period. And by 2050, also heading towards that 70–75%. So cities will have to absorb the growth in population. Now, how will they do that? Will that become more of the mega cities? Or will it be a greater number of cities which are individually smaller? Well, again, that's a question. That will depend on policies and policy developments. But the overall trend to urbanization is fairly well set in place across all these storylines. Let me again highlight a couple of the predetermined trends. The influence of countries like the USA, the world's largest economy, the world's, from an energy point of view, largest user of commercial energy, primary energy, at about over 23% of the world's primary energy is used in the United States. China, world's largest population. Actually, the second largest consumer of energy, at over 12% as well. The USA, a hub for security, a hub for finance and innovation, a hub for the legal system. Just a reminder around security that the United States defense spending is bigger than the next 4 countries put together. A legal center. Increasingly, the legal approaches of the United States are being applied elsewhere, either because of the outreach of United States legislation and the desire of people around the world to try and bring their cases to court in the United States because of perceived legislative advantages of doing that. So very much a legal center. Now, in fact, legal costs, and this surprised me, legal costs in the United States are running at 2 to 3% of GDP, which compares with just over 3% on military spending. So that is a very significant predetermined trend, particularly as that approach spreads around the world. China, just highlighting that as clearly as a manufacturing hub. The growth of the economy over the recent years. In the 10 years to 2003, China's share in world trade went from just over 2% to over 5%, more than doubled in 10 years. I have been in China twice recently, in Shanghai and Beijing, and I've been astonished. I've been absolutely astonished at the vibrancy of the economic development, the prosperity, and the increasing openness. There are areas where people are sometimes unwilling or find it difficult still to be open about in terms of discussions, and they're clearly carrying many generations of angst, of difficulty with coming to terms with things in the past. But the vibrancy and the pace of development is unbelievable. I was speaking with young people from my company, but also in universities. And I noticed, I was with somebody in my company who took me to visit the students. And she was somebody who graduated 7 years ago. So she was about then 7 years, not a generation, a little bit of a generation beyond the folk I was meeting. But there was a generational gap between them in terms of their openness to ask me questions and difficult questions, and to probe me, and to bring up subjects that certainly would never have been brought up 7 years before. So again, the influence of China, manufacturing hub, and with an opening attitude, not only economically, but currently an opening attitude in many other facets as well. And again, a trend continuing, a predetermined trend on globalization. Obviously the economic opening and the integration of markets, but also the influence of technology on connectedness. Here in Finland, of course, there's a high focus on information technology. Clearly we have also in my industry, integration of energy systems. So we have continued globalization. Although there is now a change coming in within that overall trend of globalization. And this will be explored in the storylines I'll outline a little while. But certainly, what was happening in the 80s and 90s was globalization in which national governments seemed to fade in influence. There was a kind of a retreat, a stepping back of national governments as the markets were being integrated and the technology was linking people, and there was this sense that governments should get off our back. There was a sense that governments best served society by facilitating through soft power, through frameworks, through enabling, and not through direct intervention. In my country, there was significant privatization of state-owned industries, etc., etc. So that leads to the next step in this storyline setting. What are the critical uncertainties? What are the branching points that are taking these predetermined trends in different directions? What is shaping the alternative mental maps we spoke about? Well, I talked about the 80s and 90s. Hardly need to say that we are in the noughties now and into a new century. And one of the most fundamental things that we've seen, of course, has been a set of crises. I've called them crises of security and market trust. I think we all felt at 9/11 that there was something fundamental happening in the global system. I remember where I was on 9/11. I'm sure you know where you were. I was with people from all over the world. I was with my team, or a good part of my team, from Shell Global Solutions, with about a few hundred folk in. We were in Europe, but we had people from all over the world. And I remember somebody coming in to the meeting and saying, "You should see what's happening on television." And we went out and we viewed with shock, awe, what was happening. And I can tell you the pain of the people in that gathering, the concern of, particularly, of course, the folk from the United States in that gathering, was palpable. And I'm sure there were the same kind of responses here. Of course, there have been many other events, but that seemed to be a pivotal sort of event. It's certainly emblematic of a change. And then the scandals around the markets which had been seeming to serve for so long, suddenly being seen as a place where bad things happened, shameful things happened. I just highlight there one scandal, of course, the Enron scandal. So, what do we see? We see insecurity. This is just an overview of people who were asked, something like 40-odd thousand people around the world, surveyed by Gallup, 51 countries, whether they think the world will be becoming less safe or safer. And you can see the bulk of people believe now that the world is a less safe place. The only exception there, and this is at that particular time, late 2003, is West Asia, which is basically India, Pakistan area, where there was a reduction for a little while in tensions there. But that sense of insecurity being expressed by people. And then you can ask the question of who do you trust? Who do you trust? And again, a similarly large survey. And you'll find distrust. I guess there are people here from Parliament, there are politicians. So distrust of politicians. Distrust of large national companies globally. And distrust of global companies like my own. So that those who have influenced and held power are not trusted. Although the armed forces in these countries have tended to be trusted, at least when they've been within an institutional context that people respect. So people respect discipline if it's applied in a disciplined way. People also respect non-governmental organizations. They expect the United Nations to be a good thing. They may not know anything about the United Nations. They may not know about some of the problems that it has with its own internal corruptions and its own internal practices. However, they expect it to be a good thing. So let's just a little bit about insecurity and distrust. So the question is, how will that play through? How will that shape the world going forward? Will it be shaped in a bolt-on way? One of the storylines we'll talk about kind of like a bolt-on way, that we bolt on rules and checks and balances to take forward. So it's not really resolved, but it's kind of controlled. Or will it be done in a way that is integrated? Somehow in the way that we naturally do things, we resolve issues of security and trust. Or will it be done by reducing dependence, by taking distance from each other? It's another possibility. Coming back, though, to one of the things that have been very clear over the last 5 years is the re-emergence of the state onto the world stage. Strong states. Obviously, I've highlighted here Washington, the US, and US foreign policy, but also I can highlight US actions such as the Sarbanes-Oxley requirements on companies like my own and the influence of that. China we've talked about as well, and clearly Russia. You know, the effective retaking of the commanding heights, the energy industry, for instance, back into to state control. And so strong states, very significant. So looking at these different forces playing out, as I say, in the 80s and 90s, we basically saw that the forces of the market, of efficiency, of corporations and suppliers, and the forces of society, the forces of community, were actually the axis on which the storylines were working through. And our global scenarios at the time were about different balances between those forces, whether the societies going forward were going to be more shaped by social institutions and cultural effects, or by market institutions and market effects. But now we clearly have the re-emergence of the state activity in a very visible way, a very obvious way, as a response to the crisis of security and trust. So more evidence of a mindset around coercion, around regulation. And so these are the forces and the pressures that are being played out through these scenarios in the different ways they might manifest themselves. And so within that so-called trilemma, that triangle, you can imagine a different balance of those forces. And what that really amounts to is that the different actors of influence are acting in different kinds of coalitions, and ultimately a whole region or a society or a set of regions or even a globe, you can kind of summarize in a point or the dynamics of movement around that trilemma. So it may well be that you have coalitions forming in which, say as in the 1980s and 90s, the state was less prominent per se, but exercised influence through the fact that it was supporting the development of markets and the development of the social institutions and the like. So that's that kind of picture. Or it may be different. It may be the state and coalitions with the support of the market and business activity and the like. And then non-governmental organizations are still influential, but they work by acting through and on the states and on the businesses, rather than having a prominent role themselves. So what we've done is develop 3 storylines around those 2 areas where you get balances of 2 more influential and 1 less visible And those scenarios are low-trust globalization, open doors, and flags, and I'll briefly talk through them. So first of all, the low-trust globalization. Features of this world. Okay, this is a world in which the states and the markets are the most influential characters. So features of that world. This is a world, to give you a mental model, of lawyers and accountants. Okay? It's carrots and sticks. It's compliance. Yep. The state is very active, but in a market-friendly way. Large multinationals are able to have some advantages, actually, in this environment, because there's a lot of costs of compliance, and it's easier for large companies to carry those costs of compliance, even though they are very costly and they have an impact on efficiency and the like. This is a world, politically, of coalitions of the willing. This is the world where states will act together, but only act together if they believe that they can trust each other and that they have a reason to believe that they can trust each other because they have either mutual interest or that they have another connection with each other that ensures that they act in alignment. So that's low-trust globalization, just a snapshot. Legalistic world, a world of real politics, and a world with a market-friendly hand but with strong state intervention. Let me take the next one. Open doors. Open doors. Now, open doors, in contrast to the world of low-trust globalization, which was a prove-it-to-me world, this is a world that is a know-me world. This is a world of connection rather than focus only on compliance. Pragmatic world, a world in which reputation is very, very important. But reputation not just because of the past, but because there's ongoing use of questionnaires, of rating agencies, of the investigative media, and there is a compliance to more trustful norms through the cost of loss of reputation. In the world here, contrasted with the low-trust globalization, research activities are very much more international and connected and collaborative, whereas in the low-trust globalization world, research was more in small clusters and groups and with a much higher emphasis on the security of intellectual property. Finally, I'll mention flags, the flags world, that different combination. And the flags world is a kind of follow-me world. It's a world, actually, in which there is distrust. And it's kind of been managed by greater fragmentation, by creating distance, by recognizing there is still globalization, there's still connection between economies, but those people are not really like us. And so we keep our distance. It's a world with borders. It's a world in which trade flows, but it flows in a more sticky way. People are defined by differences. It's, it's the world in which, just to take an example from the UK news just a few days ago, where in a holiday flight back to the United Kingdom, a plane load of people decided that 2 people shouldn't get on the plane because they didn't really trust them. They were different in some way. And so you've got something, a group defined itself by a difference against some other people. So it's not just at the governmental level, but with ideas, people put up the flag. So it's a world of that kind of populist leader puts up the flag, and you choose which flags you rally round, whether they're ethnic flags, whether they're ideological flags, whether they're national flags. That's the the basis of that. And they reflect three different resolutions of that crisis that I talked about, as I say. The first one being bolt-on activity, the second one being integrated through the way that things are done, and the third one being through a greater distance and disconnection. Now, there's a significant impact of these different storylines. So they're not just storylines that are fun in themselves, and you have to start thinking through what is the impact. So in detail and in depth, how do these scenarios look? Well, for instance, clearly, economic activity is significant, prosperity is significant, and you get different growth rates in these worlds. And you play that out over more than 20 years, and you get a world which has got 40% higher prosperity in one type of environment than in the other type of environment. And indeed, as Andrew said, happiness is not necessarily directly correlated with prosperity, particularly if you're in a wealthy environment. But it is quite strongly correlated, as you showed, Andrew, if you're in a world of poverty. So actually, these scenarios make a very big difference in global sense between the amount of poverty alleviation capacity that's present in the world, and hence on the well-being of those who are currently mired in poverty. Just influence little, or say a little bit about the way that influences energy. Because if you are a highly developed country, you have had industrialization, and the increase in energy that is required to fuel increases in the economy becomes less as you become richer. We move into more service economies. I'm from the energy industry, as has been said, but I'm actually from an energy family. Generation of my family have been in the energy business. But the difference is they worked in coal mines. My dad, my granddad, and my great-granddad, they were coal miners. You know, I've moved from the mines into working onto minds or mindsets. Yeah? It's a difference in the way the economy works and the need for increased amounts of energy. But clearly, as countries like China and India have entered a phase of their development where their GDP is growing, that's growing as a result of being able to have greater industry, which is more energy intensive by its nature. And you can actually see how that it plays out in energy demand in these different scenarios. First of all, you see that there's quite a large increase in energy demand over the 20 years. But notice also the differences in growth come not in the developed world, but in the developing world. And effectively, what that is recognizing is this tension between poverty alleviation being higher in one world than another world. And it's actually playing through into the energy environment via that ladder that I just mentioned. And you can actually see that impact already. This is just an illustration. I won't go through it in any detail, but it just shows how energy growth is actually being driven by growth in the economy. And so increasing the amount of GDP, you increase the amount of energy that is required to enable that. But over time, that's had a long-term trend downwards in terms of how much energy is required, because we've been going into the service type of economic development in the developed world. But in the developing world now, as that's having a more pronounced impact, just in relative terms, on the world economy, you can see that that energy intensity has turned around. There's been a discontinuity, that now the world overall is requiring more energy for economic growth rather than less and less energy for economic growth. And that's a discontinuity and a feature which will play out in different ways over the next 50 years, but certainly the next 25 years as well. And there's other impacts, because of course there is a link between traditional energies and carbon dioxide and climate change. And so in general there is a sort of a level that is recognized as being a just about acceptable level of atmospheric CO2 of around about 550 parts per million volume before the climate change becomes too pronounced or too accelerated. And you can see that these different scenarios bring you in that direction. But in fact, the scenario that does the most for poverty alleviation is the scenario that takes you already in 25 years beyond the 550 parts per million volume, unless there are significant developments in the areas of carbon capture and sequestration. And so again, we find ourselves in storylines, none of which are comfortable. In a sense, a storyline such as flags, which is uncomfortable in one sense because it's a bit disconnected, actually postpones another issue. Very interesting for there to be national dialogues around those kinds of areas. Now, of course, I've spoken at a global level, and it's important to recognize that these forces play out at very different levels, and not everywhere is the same. This is not our assessment of where countries are, but in talking to different audiences, we ask them, and we have dialogues about where they believe, on average, their country is, and this just reflects where they believe they are. Or in one case, therefore, a discussion with the EU, that's meant to say aspirational EU, the European Commission and the people, the European Parliament people we were speaking with were saying, well, we aspire, obviously, for this connected environment. We aspire for that open doors type of world. But this is where different countries have kind of placed themselves. And the day before yesterday, at another presentation that I gave, we also had Tarja Kronberg from your own chairwoman of your own Green Party who was there. And she spoke through these scenarios. And she also highlighted that she felt that Finland was somewhere in the middle, but highlighted there were the three different elements to that. The parts of society that she saw that were sort of in a flags mentality, or sort of in an open doors, or sort of in a low-trust globalization. So again, these forces are playing out at different levels, and what this creates is a way to have that dialogue on the table and assess how it might play out, and in fact, whether there are preferences there. So I'll just now spend my last 5 minutes of the presentation talking about a little bit about the practical experience in using these particular vehicles as helping to have the kind of dialogue and foresight that you're seeking. So first of all, I talked about assumptions, and if you've made your assumptions explicit, you can then see whether they are robust or not under different types of outlook and types of outcome. And so this is actually one that was presented to our board by myself not long ago, but without the X's, because there's quite a lot in there that's commercially sensitive. And but I can at least tell you about one of the X's in there, because these were assumptions about the future and the outlook. So there's an assumption in there which you can see about halfway down that has green under open doors, a bit of orange in the middle, and green under flags. And that's actually an assumption about the growth of the renewables business over the next 20 years. And so you can see it's green under two very different scenarios, because it's green for different reasons. Under open doors, there is a very great demand for new energy growth, because there's a great increase in the world economy because of the connectedness. And that just pulls through as much energy as can be developed. And so there are developments in conventional area and in the non-traditional areas driven by the commercial dynamic. Prices rise, and the pricing stimulates and enables these other things to come in. And also the connectedness of research enables technological developments to move very, very quick. So that is a world with a high growth in renewables for that reason. There's a high growth of renewables in the flags world as well. And that's because of actually that closedness, because people are seeking to exploit indigenous resources, and renewable resources are almost by definition, almost always indigenous resources. You know, windy places, wind energy there. Biofuels, places where you can develop biomass and biofuels. That's a local type of activity. So again, the scenarios help you see opportunities in different worlds, but also opportunities with different drivers to understand. You can also start looking at what are the signposts, what's actually emerging, and how do we understand that? I won't run through all of these, but just highlight a couple of them. China, mentioned earlier. Well, we know what's been happening with Google in China and the relationship there, and the interventions of China with Google. And yet Google is happening, so there is this level of connectedness, but with state intervention. And equally, China's overseas investments on a bilateral basis with African countries around the energy industry. Well, that's very reminiscent of a low-trust globalization thread coming through. Also, in the US, limits to pure state intervention, and instead working through coalitions of the willing, a sort of more pragmatic approach. It's really going to be very, very significant signpost to see how the current tensions over the Iranian nuclear developments are going to be handled. That will give us signals about really the mentality we're running in. Because issues around Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and others are reminiscent of the flags mentality. And I'm just on the news again today, I was just reminded, if anybody was watching, about Bolivia. Bolivia renationalized its energy resources not long ago, and it changed all the rules, and there are some payments that are required today. And again, that's reminiscent of a flags mentality. And yet robust economic growth has continued, this connectedness, this open doors thread. The responses to the tsunami disaster were very, very impressive, and again reflected that mindset of connectedness. So as you prepare for the future, it's valuable to think about this as a potential vehicle for dialogue, but it's a vehicle that has to become embedded in the natural habit of the way that you do things. So we've been working over almost 40 years in this way, and have become quite well known for it. But it's had influence at different times and in different ways, and that develops. But because of that, somebody like myself who joined the company in 1980 has been touched by scenario thinking in different ways over time. So whilst people often refer back to the energy crises of the 70s, in which some of the scenario work that was done helped Shell prepare for that because it was one of the things that had been thought through beforehand, then I've seen how the work that was done in the 1980s really prefigured the emergence of the green issues onto the public agenda around the globe and sustainable development. And it helped prepare Shell to participate in that. And hence it's not surprising like a company like ours was highly active in enabling institutions such as the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So that was one element. In the 1990s, the work prefigured ultimately our development of Shell Renewables, Shell Wind Energy, and Shell Hydrogen, the company that I was the chief executive of until recently. Those were formed in the late 1990s as a result of thinking that went on, stimulated by scenario thinking in the earlier 90s. So again, as you look over time, you'll see these applied in different ways. And it's something that's important for you to absorb, is that often this thinking, because it's taking people out of their current operations and comfort zones, is not easy for people. You will not necessarily be popular as a result of stimulating this kind of debate and discussion. I have been told at times that, Jeremy, we respect your work, but recognize you are tolerated, but not always embraced. Okay, I can live with that. I'm a big boy. So you have to recognize that sometimes you will not be embraced, but seek to turn it into a habit, a way of having this discussion. Bring it into your DNA. Don't stay away from the hard issues. There's a hard issue I highlighted there about poverty alleviation and about climate change. Don't stay away from those hard things. Debate. Are you willing to invest to benefit the vulnerable, believing that that will ultimately help you? So, don't be too Finland-centric in your dialogue either. Recognize that you are connected. I'm sure you do, and I know you do. But I just want to emphasize that point. These are mindsets that operate globally. And not only do you have to accept them, but also you are parties that will influence them. So please influence them in what you consider to be a positive direction, and accept that even in doing that, now with the EU presidency, you may not always be embraced. So thanks very much anyway.
Now we are a little bit behind the schedule, but we still have some time for questions. Please.
Question.
Mika Mannermaa.
Thank you for your very clear presentation. Writing scenarios is very difficult as such, but identifying critical uncertainties is even more demanding. Could you recommend us, for the corporations and other actors making scenarios, some specific methods to identify critical uncertainties? They are usually new phenomena, surprises, so you can't make mathematical models, trend models, because there are no time series. But do you use some specific methods to identify critical uncertainties?
Yes, I'll tell you what we've done in some of this path to these scenarios. One thing is to have bring together groups in different parts of the world with different backgrounds, so different thinking, so large groups, and run exercises in which they themselves think about the different storylines into the future. So they're not really scenarios because they are well worked through and thought through, but in a couple of hours you can introduce particular subject areas and get people kind of debating them and actually mapping out potentially different pathways. And if you begin to gather those pathways from people in different circumstances, people with different perspectives, from either geographical perspectives or different backgrounds in terms of the kinds of industries they're operating in, or whether they're from government and the like, you can begin to identify the branching points that seem to be the most significant. And then you can go away and do analytical work that says, really, is that very, very significant? So, for instance, let me give you an example. Taking some of this work into the context of Russia, as we work things through, I felt that a critical uncertainty going forward would be how will it be played out that the current level of underinvestment in the oil side of the industry, when oil production begins to tail off, partly as a result of that in Russia, and revenues reduce, will that be a branching point? Yes, it will be, but it turned out to be not as significant as the 2008 election process and what happens post-Putin. So, in a sense, those are both branching points, but one is more significant than another as we've worked it through and thought it through.